I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm talking about inflation colonization and why inflation should really be called dilution. A lot of people are talking about bail-ins these days, most notably Ellen Brown, and then also Matt Ehret, who has dusted off a podcast from I think when he was in college. I was also talking about them a while ago from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. And I'm going to read part of Death by Moody's and how that took down Greece and Cyprus. And then I'll also be looking at derivatives and the effect that those derivatives have had on places like Detroit. So I want to look at the interest rate itself and why your house isn't worth more. Your money's worth less. And look at an example that I give in my book. But primarily, my book is about solutions. And James Corbett was just talking on something I was listening to about how we need to have decentralized solutions. So I'm going to ask the question, if you had a genie who said you have one wish for how you can change the system, what should you wish for? Let's look at this. To start, I want to give you a very graphic example of how inflation steals the value of your money. This is the hospital bill for when I was born back in the dark ages, so 1957. Now, if you look at this, you'll see that it is $11 a day for a room in the hospital. For a nurse, it is $3 a day. The delivery room was $16, intravenous something or other, I think was $10. So altogether, for a 5-day stay in the hospital, it came to $117, of which the insurance paid $75 and my parents paid $42. And my mom wrote at the bottom, "And you were worth every penny." Now, I may not have known whether it was my mom or my dad who wrote that, but my daughter was pen pals with her grandma for a while, and so she knew that that was her writing. I'm not proud of the fact that I wouldn't recognize my mom's writing, but I am proud to have raised a daughter who does. Exhibit 2. This is the scholarship that I had for full room and board. For 1 year, it was $2,400. That same college now cost $50,000 a year. I know that because as a scholarship kid, they hit me up for donations. Futilely, I might add. In my book, I have an address that Tom Engelhart says he would never be asked to give at a commencement. He says, "Today we know that the class that preceded you was the most indebted in the history of higher education, and you'll surely break that record. And no wonder with college tuition still rising wildly, up 1,120% since 1978. And this was back in 76. On average, you will have rung up at least $33,000 in debt, and for some of you the numbers will be much higher. That, by the way, is more than double what it was those same 2 decades ago. We have some sense of how this kind of debt plays out in the years to come, and the news isn't good. Those of you with major school debts will be weighed down in all sorts of ways. You'll find yourselves using your credit cards more than graduates without debt. You'll be less likely to buy a home. In other words, a striking percentage of you will leave this campus in the kind of financial hole that, given the job market of 2015, you may have a problem making your way out of. And last, I'll show you, this is a life insurance policy, a payout from when my grandmother died when I was still in high school, and it was for $375, which at the time she bought that was a fortune. Remember, I grew up in an era when penny candy was really a thing. And so these amounts, no matter how much you scrape and put away, it will never be enough. It will always be leaching through your fingers because they keep devaluing the money by making it where it's not backed by the same amount of goods and services. What causes inflation? They make us think that this is just sort of a natural occurrence. Money grows, and that's how they convince us to gamble with our savings. But what I've put together in my book, most of you probably already know the way that money is created is through debt, through the international banking cartel of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Fed, that they issue mortgages and they issue only the principal, not the interest. And that creates 96-97% of the dollars that are in circulation. And that, of course, is a problem because halfway through that, they run out because you need to pay back at 5.3% twice as much as you've borrowed. So they need inflation. They need to keep diluting the value of money so that that ends up creating more. So what I put together was looking at if you had $1,000 that you could repay on a mortgage, and that mortgage started at, say, 10%, that what would the value of the principal be that you could pay with that? And so it starts out at 10% at $115,000. And then at 9% goes to 125, then 137, 150,000, and by the time it gets to 1%, it's 310,000. So it almost triples just by lowering the interest rate. Of course, they never just lower it. They always wobble it to make sure that you hurry up and go out there and refinance. Every time that you refinance, it pushes more money out into the economy. And that's what they need. They need that to flush out the labor to be able to come back to them, because all of that money is coming back to them. And the interest is coming back to them in profits. The principal cancels out, but the interest goes back to the bankers. So essentially, the entire value of the house goes back to them. When I bought this house 35 years ago, the interest rate was almost 20%. And so the cost of the house, I put 25% down, which you could because the cost of the house was lower. And then because, again, not as much of a bump there, I was able to pay it off. We were able to pay it off in 25 years, maybe even less. And that's possible when you have a low cost. But when it keeps going up and up and up with these low interest rates, it means that that cost has now tripled, maybe even quadrupled. And that means if you get a windfall, if you save up, if you're frugal, you can't make a dent in it. And if the job market goes down, or the interest rates, if you have a variable loan, go up, you lose everything. So that's why a fluctuating interest rate is something that does not control inflation like they're trying to kid us it does. What it does is it creates inflation, which they depend on. Now let's look at bail-ins and what happened to Greece and Cyprus back in 2012, which David Graeber says was a dress rehearsal for the likely fate of the global imperial system when it finally reaches its limits and the era comes definitively tumbling to a close. So after Greece, austerity went to the neighboring island of Cyprus, which had kept a large chunk of its bank holdings in Greek government bonds. When the Greek bonds were devalued, and there's a lot of conversation now about the relationship between how bonds are valued and the bank holdings, the island of Cyprus sunk fiscally underwater. To make matters worse, bank holdings equaled 9 times the GDP because government officials had opened Cyprus as a tax haven, particularly for Russians absconding with their own country's wealth. One Russian oligarch alone was a 10% shareholder in the Bank of Cyprus. The bank accounts of these money launderers and tax cheats were commingled with the bank accounts of ordinary Cypriots, who derived no benefit from the foreign money and bore the brunt of higher cost. In the summer of 2012, Moody's slashed Cyprus's credit rating to junk status, and Fitch downgraded their bonds so they would no longer be accepted as collateral on loans. This meant that Cyprus was unable to raise money in the ordinary way by selling bonds and passing the sovereign debt on to taxpayers. Instead, the open bank resolution of the 2010 BIS committee had this advice: when bank failures become too expensive for governments to bail out the lenders, the losses should be shifted to the bank's shareholders and creditors. We've been hearing that word, shareholders, which, surprise, surprise, includes depositors. Legally, as it turns out, when money is deposited in a bank, they own it. In return, the depositor is given a credit account, which is considered a liability or debt of the bank. If the bank goes belly up, depositors are considered unfunded creditors and get in line after the financial firms and central banks that have bought the bank's debt. In addition, Ellen Brown has written extensively about derivatives, and I'll put the link in the Substack. These are bets that have a value of, I think, 400 times the GDP of the entire world. So if those bets go bad and there's a bankruptcy, they're the first ones in line ahead of you and your deposits. So she's linked I think 6 different banks that have the highest amount of derivative exposure. And those are, I think, important for us to be paying attention to protect ourselves while we weather this. And weathering it means we're going to be in a whole new place. And I think that that's something we need to prepare for, both personally and also in terms of thinking about what that might mean and what might be possible. What this is all leading towards, without a question, is central bank digital currencies, which are going to ride in and save the day after they threaten to take all of our savings. But that same thing may be the genie that gives us a chance to say, what is our wish? Here's the one thing that I would wish for that would make the most difference, I believe. Only commonwealths of fewer than 300,000 people have the right to issue and control the credit that's backed by the housing in their territory. What that would enable us to do is to take back power over both our real estate, our homes, and also over our labor, so that our labor can serve the community. And in my book, I go into a lot of detail in terms of what I call the carrot system, the little sign on the keyboard. And I have other episodes called Reinventing Education, Reinventing Retirement, looking at how that could work. But a question for you, because commonwealths are all different. The whole idea is you get to control it. You get to set what's your exchange rate for dollars or whatever your imperial currency is. What is it that you're going to tax it at when it gets exchanged back for that imperial currency? And I think a big question for you is, would you have a fluctuating interest rate? Or would you do what Benjamin Franklin said, which is that the interest rate should be 5%. It should never change. And that way, when there's too much money and money is cheap, then people will end up paying off their debts. And when there's not enough money, they'll end up taking out debts and replenishing. So it becomes a self-regulating system. I would be aiming for that. But personally, in my own Commonwealth, what I'd start out by doing is saying anyone can take an existing house and refinance it, especially if you've got a variable loan, for 3%. And that 3% will stay steady for the 30 years of that loan. But 6 months from then, it will go up to 3.1% and then 3.2 3 months after that. And it will continue to go up until it reaches 5%. So that way, people know that if you're going to buy a house, if you're going to refinance a house, you better get it out of that Imperial Bank and put it into the Commonwealth Bank as quickly as you can. And then you don't have to force people to do that. You can just have the carrot and not the stick. For more on restoring local sovereignty, here's Reinventing Education, and then this is Reinventing Retirement. We need to be thinking about these questions and what kind of policies you'd put in. We need to be dreaming together.